Thank you for tuning in to Eco Justice Radio. I'm your host, Jack Eidt. It is my honor to welcome our guest, Scott Paul. Welcome to Eco Justice Radio.
Thanks, Jack. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, great to have you. I'm really excited to get into these questions, what you're doing out in the world for Taylor Guitars, and a lot about your history here. And so we'll start off. We want to know about why you ended up devoting most of your life to forest activism. But first, let's have you define what is a forest to you, and then can you explain why you've dedicated your life to them or it?
Wow, what is a forest? I don't know if I want to start in my left brain or right brain to answer that question because
Please, throw them both at us.
Okay. And I laugh just because I have spent much of my life in international meetings, UN meetings, conferences, listening to people debate over what is a forest and what is deforestation. And once upon a time, when I was just starting out, I started writing down deforestation, writing down definitions of what is a forest and what is deforestation. And I literally had 20 pages of 10-point font on my WordPerfect document of all the different definitions of what makes a forest, what constitutes deforestation. And, to slip over to the right side of my brain, it's kind of in the eye of the beholder. I mean, you know it when you see it. A row of trees that are all the same age and same species, that's really not a forest to me. A forest is a complex living organism that's evolving over time with different age class, different temperature variations. It's a living, functioning, evolving ecosystem on one extreme, and it's a bloody cornfield on the other. And they both tend to get called a forest generically in society. So the trick is defining what's in between a monocultural timber plantation, which frankly has its place in need in society, and an actual healthy surviving ecosystem that you and I would think of as a forest.
Right. So so you decided to devote your life to forest activism. How'd that come about?
By accident, like most things in life. You and I grew up together as young boys in Western Massachusetts, going to the same high school. And it was Amherst, Massachusetts. It's a rural environment. It certainly was at that time. So I was no stranger to the outdoor lifestyle, but never thought much about it. Honestly, the big epiphany, and it truly was an epiphany for me. At one point after college, I didn't know what I wanted to do, and I ran away to Central America. I had a backpack in American Express traveler's checks, and my goal was to last a year. And I ended up working as a volunteer park ranger for the Costa Rican National Park Service. And I rotated to various parks, and one of the parks I was at was Poas Volcano. And back then in the 80s, no one went to the parks in Monday through Thursday, like maybe one person would show up. But I nonetheless would have to climb to the top of the crater area and be there all alone. So there was a very contemplative situation. But the epiphany was I just realized I was really happy. I was happier than I was at any point in my entire life. And why was I happy? And at that point, all I knew is that I wanted to do international forest stuff. And that's about as defined as it was. But that became my North Star. And if I knew it or not, everything I did from that point was somehow related to international forest stuff. And I stayed true to that North Star. And now I look in the rearview mirror and I said, oh, this path all makes perfect sense. It didn't make sense in real time, when you're young and you're trying to figure out what's your next step, what's your next job. But I followed my North Star of international forest stuff and had a pretty wacky, diverse set of life experiences.
Yeah, so why don't we get into some of those in terms of your stepping stones? Like, how did you jump into it? Because I mean, I think starting off in that Costa Rica world, which it's changed a lot, but kind of some of the work that you were doing set up the framework. I wouldn't say you specifically, but how do you see what happened? Your vision of Costa Rica back in, maybe it was the late 80s or early 90s. I don't exactly remember, but
let's say mid 80s.
anyways, how did that all come together for you?
So I'm in Costa Rica, and I was traveling actually all throughout Central America. And, to make my money go further, I was a volunteer at an orphanage in Guatemala for a couple of months. They give you bed and food if you work. I was a volunteer at the Costa Rica National Park Service. They give you a bed and some food if you work back then. But eventually I ran out of money, and I could go back and live at my parents' house, or I could sleep on my brother's couch in Washington, D.C. And I chose my brother's couch in Washington, D.C. because, international forest stuff seemed more like a Washington, D.C. thing than a Western Massachusetts thing. And I had a lot of temping jobs, just like catering and gutter cleaning and anything to survive. But my big break was, it's a long story, but a bizarre story. I ended up as an intern in the Clinton administration, White House environmental policy, they called it at that time. And I spent a year at the White House as an unpaid intern and doing international forest stuff. And that gave me exposure to a lot of the environmental groups who I had been, soliciting for the previous year, and frankly wouldn't give me the time of day. But suddenly I was at the White House and they all wanted to, have access. I was some sort of gatekeeper by default. Little did they know, I had no clue what I was doing. But I got a job after a year, I got a job with a NGO that, this was not that long after the Rio Earth Summit in 1992. And the Rio Earth Summit changed everything for an international forest policy person. They have the Rio framework. In 1992, the Rio Earth Summit gave us the Biodiversity Convention, the Climate Convention, the Oceans Convention, the desertification. 4 of them, I think we got. We were supposed to have 5. The big one going into Rio was the Forest Convention. That's the one everyone talked about. It was the marquee convention to negotiate. That convention was sacrificed as a result of the politics of Rio, the North-South clash that was the Rio Earth Summit. So there wasn't a forest convention. And all anyone knew was that the decade to come, the UN was destined to try to untie the forest knot that was the Rio fight. So I worked for an NGO that was tasked to follow all the UN forest talks. Every 6 months, New York or Geneva, New York, back and forth between the UN headquarters in New York and Geneva as they wrestled with this. It's a really interesting time because it was the very beginning of the Rio framework. So as a forest policy guy, you have before Rio, and then you have after Rio. And almost anything you read now in college or whatever about the international environmentalism is all influenced and based by the Rio framework. And I got to understand pre-Rio and post-Rio. Anyway, that was a bit of a rabbit hole. But I ended up at Greenpeace. I spent 14 years at Greenpeace. That was the proving grounds for me. That was like the French Foreign Legion. It was a really incredible 14 years of my life.
Well, listen, I want to get more into Greenpeace in a second, but I want to just ask a follow-up question on these. Do you think that these international summits, because we're doing a lot of climate summits these days, and, are they doing any good? Are you seeing progress? I think embedded in your comment earlier is that there started to be more progress, but on the ground, how does that look?
Interesting question. A couple of different ways to answer it. I'll answer it in 2 ways. One, back when I was more intimately involved, I still go to UN meetings. And but not like I used to do. And when I was doing this in the 90s, you really had a lot of access. You don't have the security barriers. This was before the WTO riots, which also changed the security infrastructure around a lot of these big international meetings. We would sit up in the peanut gallery and watch the negotiations. And if you needed to, you could walk on the floor, you could walk across the floor, walk up to the US government or the Canadian government or the Brazilian government, whoever you happen to know, whisper in their ear, perhaps have a brief conversation and then politely walk away. You had that type of access. Negotiators would get up and you'd be like, oh, a cigarette break for that guy. And you would meet him outside and try to buttonhole him and have a conversation. That has all completely changed. At the big international conferences, you're lucky to be in the same town. You're certainly not in the same building. So you don't have the access, and they're more like a massive concert. It's a spectacle. In what I grew up with, so to speak, was you had much more influence, you had more access. It was dare I say, a simpler time. But the other way to answer your question is, let's just look at, the climate convention and when they had the Paris Agreement. At that time, there was a tremendous amount of political will, obviously, but there wasn't the technology to do what they wanted to do wasn't really there. Fast forward to today, and some of the technological breakthroughs that are happening are really, really encouraging, really, really promising, but there was zero political will. So, these things flip and flop. Life is about timing, and occasionally you do make a leap forward. It helps when the political will is lined up with other factors like technology, for example, that being just one. But for me, you have to be an optimist. If you're not an optimist, then why are you here? Like, why are you just go live in your fallout shelter and have a wonderful life. No disrespect intended, but you can't fight if you don't think you can win. If you don't think you can win, why are you there? That's just my personal opinion. And you can have a different opinion, and that's cool with me.
Well, I share that opinion, which is, even though often you could argue it's folly, but nevertheless, we persist.
Well, I got to get out of bed for some reason.
Yeah. So I'm interested in some of the forest campaigns that you worked on while you were at Greenpeace. You spent a good deal down in the Amazon River Basin. Could you tell us about the people you worked with and the places you were working to protect?
Yeah, it's all far in the rearview mirror now, but for a while there, I used to kind of consider myself the Forrest Gump of, international forest activism, because I had a front row seat. Sometimes I was driving the bus, sometimes I was lucky to be on the bus for some of the great campaigns of a 20-year period. I really joined in the Clayoquot Sound. And if people don't know Clayoquot Sound, it's today a UNESCO Biosphere Reserve, a testament to activism. It's on Vancouver Island. It's a World Heritage Site. It's one of the most beautiful places on the planet. It was getting logged to death. And a campaign, the Clayoquot Sound campaign, that was just wrapping up when I came in. So I saw the last few years, Clayoquot Sound expanded along the Canadian coast, Canada's California and BC. They called it the Great Bear Rainforest Campaign. That was, in my opinion, still to this day, one of the most important environmental forest campaigns. It gave birth to what was called at the time markets campaigning, where the epiphany was, hippie, calls logger, bad. It isn't really news. But if the activist, the hippie, does its research and figures out who are the customers, who are the large internationally branded customers who are buying from the other end of the supply chain, from what we would consider the worst of the worst loggers in the best of the best places, and then approach the end customers and say, hey, did you know that you're buying from someone who's buying from someone who's buying from Satan? And it was really effective. And we had a good 10-year run at Clockwood Sound was the proving grounds for that. On throughout the Great Bear Rainforest. It then went to the Amazon, and markets campaigns were applied to Amazon. First with trees and mahogany, which was a big campaign that I worked on. And this is the birth of illegal logging, which once upon a time, you could not whisper the words illegal logging into a UN microphone because it would just destroy the day, and they wouldn't talk about it. It was taboo to discuss. Didn't exist. And that
I'm having trouble wrapping my brain around such a harsh reality being taboo to discuss.
Well, it's funny. I do remember when it was 1997 when the logjam broke. You could not say illegal logging because illegal logging was too closely associated with official government corruption in a lot of countries on the planet. And if you said illegal logging, a lot of governments just say, oh, no. And you only have a week or two to negotiate. And if you throw something back then, like illegal logging on the table, you basically sacrificed the day because they weren't going to let it happen. So all these parliamentary procedure games kick in, and it's just like, oh crap, the next 4 hours is gone because someone threw this on the table. And in 1997, that all changed. Credit where credit is due. The U.S. government, a woman named Jan McAlpin at like 11 o'clock at night, in an obscure moment when most of the major governments are gone, and they had their B team at the microphone or their C team at the microphone, Jan slipped in illegal logging, the words illegal logging, and no one caught it. And I will bet my paycheck that's the first time that illegal logging stuck. Wow. And then a few years later, when the U.S. was hosting the Denver G7 summit, in another fantastic story, comedy of errors, illegal logging ended up being on the Denver G7. Actually, it was G8 was the first time Russia was invited. The G8 work program. They said, we're going to eliminate illegal logging. And that was this atomic bomb because not only could you not say illegal logging up to that moment, but suddenly the G8 says we're going to eliminate it. Now, the people that wrote that had no idea the political implications of what they wrote, but the ink dried and that document exists. And then everything changed. The world pivoted and we were out of the closet. We were proud. Illegal logging is a thing. You can't stop us now. And the entire political landscape changed once illegal logging was a recognized thing. And it was a huge moment.
Well, and we still have the struggle to stop that illegal logging. So we can talk a little bit more about your work. We're going to take a break and come back with Scott Paul from Taylor Guitars, and we'll be back in a sec. So we're back. So Scott Paul, would you want to continue? We were talking about some of the work that you've done in the past decades with Greenpeace and other entities. You want to continue where you left off?
Yeah, just to kind of fast forward, with Greenpeace, I spent a lot of time in the Amazon that when illegal logging was really just becoming a recognized, publicly recognized thing. And we did some of the earliest research, Greenpeace Brazil and Greenpeace US, documenting illegal logging in the Amazon, in particular mahogany. That ended up resulting in mahogany, big leaf mahogany, Swatenia macrophylla, being listed on the Convention for International Trade in Endangered Species, CITES. The end result of a 2-year Greenpeace campaign moved big leaf mahogany into a greater protective status on this international convention. That's where, if I'm known for anything, I'm known for having been the first person in 100 years to be arrested for sailor mongering. And it was that campaign that all that happened. So after the Mahogany campaign, we ran a very famous campaign against Kimberly-Clark, the world's largest tissue products company. We had some issues with Kimberly-Clark. That was a very successful campaign. And today, Kimberly-Clark is among the most responsible tissue companies in the world. So I'm very proud of that one. And several other moments and campaigns I kicked around. I worked for an alternative fiber bamboo startup company for a while. And then one day, Bob Taylor at Taylor Guitars called me up, who I had been friends with, because another campaign that I ran that I haven't mentioned is the Music Wood campaign. And there was an independent documentary called Music Wood, the documentary, that I think you can still find buried in the internet. It was a campaign looking at musical instruments purchasing of what they call tone woods. You know, what are the woods that for hundreds of years musical instruments have purchased to craft their musical instruments? Those species are not purchased randomly. There's a lot of tradition and testing and functioning around why we use certain species. And
So
I'll
Scott,
stop there, but
yeah, I think we want to really drill down. No, that's the wrong way to talk about it. We want to understand more about these things, but I want to go back to a couple things that you were sort of going through quickly. So back to your Greenpeace days, you referred to a term that I'm sure most of our listeners don't understand, and particularly how it would relate to forests. So what is sailor mongering, and why were you convicted of it?
yeah, sailor mongering, the quick answer is go to Wikipedia. But so, okay, we document that 98% of the Brazilian mahogany trade in 2000 was illegal. It was logs were being cut where they weren't supposed to be cut. And the Brazilian government agreed. The Brazilian government was 100% in lockstep with Greenpeace. We had documented it. They had verified it. And the Brazilian government at one point shut down the global mahogany trade, which was huge. I mean, this is one of the most commercially lucrative traded species. And Brazil just said, no more. And if you've got it on a ship headed to your country, or you're unloading it at your port, please seize it, European Union, US, wherever. And it was a hugely politically dramatic moment. One of the most lucrative forest products trade was frozen. What's going to happen? And at that time, we got a lot of news. We were on the front page of the Wall Street Journal. We were on the front page of a lot of major newspapers. But time kept going by, and time kept going by. And we knew that somebody was going to pay somebody, and somehow this was going to go away. And we hadn't solved the problem. We just kind of turned the lights on and caught them. And then we found out that a shipment of mahogany was being smuggled out of Belém, a city in the Amazon, destined for Miami. And it was mahogany, but it was mislabeled. It was illegally, intentionally mislabeled as another species. We documented this, and we needed to expose it. So Greenpeace does what Greenpeace does, and that it did at that time at least. And we inflated the 30-year-old Zodiacs and met a 1,000-foot cargo container ship, the APL Jade, as it was coming in what they call government cut at the port of Miami towards the cranes to be unloaded. But a few months before this, I don't remember now, 6 months before this, it was 9/11. And after 9/11, that was a huge moment, sent shockwaves through the advocacy community. And basically everyone stood down. Everyone said, like, this is not the time for us to chain ourselves to anything, or to challenge authority in any, although it was always peaceful nonviolence. I mean, at Greenpeace, it was always peaceful nonviolent, Quaker, Martin Luther King, Gandhi type philosophy. The movement stood down, writ large across the board. The movement stood down. And the first act of civil disobedience post 9/11 was this exposing this shipment coming into the port of Miami. If you remember back in the day, there was concern about a dirty bomb, and could a dirty bomb come into a major port? And the Bush administration was telling us, don't worry, it can never happen. I can't tell you why, but we got to cover it. And of course they didn't, because, the United States is an open society, and we don't, it's not a fascist state just yet. And we were able to infiltrate, 25 Greenpeace activists and 30-year-old inflatable Zodiacs were able to board a ship and drop a banner that said President Bush, stop illegal logging. And it was kind of another day at the office, but it was the first act of nonviolent civil disobedience post 9/11. And the feds came down with the wrath of God, and we all got scooped up like we knew we would. We all got sent to a federal penitentiary, which we kind of thought might happen, but it was federal. Unfortunately, it was a Friday. So we were there for, Friday night, Saturday night, Sunday night, and Monday afternoon, we saw the judge. And it's bizarre. You would think we broke several laws, but they charged us with sailor mongering, which is a law, the last known case law is from like 1872. It's actually a prostitution and liquor running offense. It was a law put in place because back in the day, last known case law, I think, was in Portland. Ships would come in and the crew would be like, oh my God, I got to get on shore and go nuts. And cities would be in cahoots, the sheriff, the brothel owner, the bartender owner, they would let the ships run wild, and then the crew won't run wild. And then when it was time to anchor up and leave, the sheriff would show up and say, whoa, you got a big bill to pay before you get out of town. And it was a bit of a scam. They were sailor mongering. And believe it or not, that's what they charged us with. At the time, we just said, all right, time served. We exposed this illegal logging, this illegal mahogany import. I pleaded guilty. Like 2 or 3 other guys pleaded guilty, and everyone else got off. And then a year later, the federal government charged Greenpeace Inc. with sailor mongering. And wow. This became a huge case because it's the first time in US history, not the civil rights movement, not the suffragette movement, not the Ku Klux Klan, did the federal government ever go after the parent organization for the protest activities of the individuals. The tradition in the US has always been, if you break the law, then you have to face the music. But the quote unquote parent organization was not liable within the eyes of the US government from a legal standpoint. But they were so angry about this protest after 9/11 that they went after Greenpeace Inc. And if we would have lost, the Greenpeace in the US, was going to be trouble. But we had amicus briefs filed from the hard right and the hard left. And because the precedent of going after the parent organization scared lobbyists and activists across the spectrum.
Yeah.
And it was a huge court case. And for a very short period of time, when we were eventually found innocent and I walked out of a courtroom in Miami, Florida, we were on CNN and Fox News and BBC. The next day it was all forgotten about. But for one moment in time, it was a really big deal, only because of the civil rights, the right to protest was for the first time in the history of the country really at stake. But then they let us go, and history kind of forgot about it. But you can still go to Wikipedia, and I've still got this on my permanent record.
I see. Well, your parents are probably concerned, but
my in-laws weren't impressed.
Exactly. So you sort of covered how you made the switch to Taylor guitars, and sort of where you went on the way to there. So, what does a lifelong forest activist do at a guitar company?
Yeah, it's interesting. Bob Taylor is a really good friend of mine, and he tends to be more to the traditional conservative side of the political spectrum, and I tend to be more to the political left side of the political spectrum. We're a little bit like the odd couple, but we have come to agree on 99% of the issues we've confronted. It wasn't like that when we first met, although we were fast friends. The reason Bob hired me and created a position that doesn't exist in nature, it's wholly unique within musical instrument manufacturing to have somebody. I don't build guitars. They don't let me near the machinery. I'm a environmental policy guy, because an acoustic guitar is made up of 5 to 6 different species, some tropical, some temperate, each selected as a part to perform a mechanical function, the neck, the fingerboard, the soundboard, back and sides, all of those species come together and have to work in concert and perform their mechanical function. And I'll just say that I've heard Bob say several times that Taylor's 50 years old, and he feels like during the course of his career, he's walked through the threshold from how it's always been to how it has to be in regard to buying wood. There were 200 years for violins, 150 years for the Western steel string guitar. The world was filled with old growth. You couldn't get anything but old growth. Anything you wanted brought to your door. You needed a bill of sale, maybe. The spruce was brought into San Diego, where Taylor Guitars is, in massive volumes, because they used to make airplanes in San Diego, and airplane wings used to be made out of spruce.
Wow.
Rosewood was brought in by actually one of the bigger industries that brought Brazilian rosewood into Southern California for the first 20 years of Taylor Guitars. 15 years Taylor Guitars were conversion vans. Remember the 70s, where they would like spray paint the van and put shag carpet in the back, and it was like the Scooby-Doo mobile. There was all that was Brazilian rosewood, all the woodworking in there. Bose used it. The point is that for 150 years, instrument makers never had to worry about where the wood came from, because the world was filled with old growth. And now it's not. Now there's 8 billion people on the planet, and there's a lot of old growth left. There's a lot of species left. The majority of them, though, are in protected areas, and they should stay in protected areas. So for Taylor, for any instrument builder, you really, for the first time in history, need to pay attention. What are they talking about over there at the United Nations? What are the policies and regulations that are coming into place fast and furious because of climate change, because of biodiversity loss, because there's an environmental crisis? Governments are reacting at a national and international level. Forest products, trees are, it's one of the major ones you talk about. And if you're a guitar maker that buys, like, we buy less than 1% of the global, we being the global guitar making industry, we buy less than 1% of the trade in any of the species that we use. We're just this tiny little guy, but we like certain woods, and we really need to pay attention to what's happening in the places where we've traditionally bought wood. Because I don't want to shock you, Jack, but people lie and people cheat, and the forest products trade, is no different than any other natural resources trade. So we need to make sure we're buying from the good guys and not the bad guys. We need to look at alternative materials. We need to look at alternative ways to build our instrument, because the resource is changing. And if the resource is changing, then we need to understand that, so we can continue to build an ever increasing quality of instrument. But we can't build it like our grandparents used to build it, because that wood is no longer available to anyone on the planet. And in 10 years, it's going to be more difficult. Bob Taylor likes to say the easiest day to buy wood to build guitars is today, because tomorrow's going to be harder. And that's why I ended up at Taylor is one, can I translate all these international policy frameworks coming into place, and what does that mean to us, and how can I represent our industry in these negotiations? And also just to be a bit of a canary in the coal mine to say, hey, hey, we might want to pivot left, right, or center here because the world is changing super fast. If you're a guitar company that buys a little bit of wood from a lot of different places.
Yeah, and so I want to get more specific on that, but why don't we take a break and come back with Scott Paul here talking about Taylor guitars and forest health. So Scott Paul, you've had your Taylor's a co-owner of the Crelicam Ebony Mill in Yaoundé, and forgive me for mispronouncing that if I did. In Cameroon, you've had some interesting experiences out there. Can you tell us about the situation in the country with regards to forests, the people that call them home, and the work that Taylor Guitars is doing within that context?
Yeah, the work we're doing in Cameroon is honestly one of the things I'm most proud of that I've been associated with in my lifetime. But to back up a little bit, again, Bob Taylor is quite clairvoyant. I mean, he's one of these people that really kind of sees around corners in a way that other people don't, I personally believe. So he was noticing challenges getting the traditionally used wood that we've used, the traditionally used species that we use to build musical instruments. Ebony is a traditionally used species. Ebony is a wholly unique species. It's one of the few black woods, which, aesthetically, violins, cellos, oboes have liked the look, and tradition is really important for musical instruments. But far more important, it's a dense, hard wood. In a violin or a cello, you don't understand the beating that a professional musician will place on a fingerboard or fretboard. Stringed musical instruments like ebony, because it looks good, but probably more important, it is tough as nails. There's not a lot of woods that can perform the mechanical function that ebony does. So, the world is changing, things are getting complicated, new laws are coming into place. Guitar makers are starting to think, oh, we need to start paying attention. And about this time, our friends at Medinter, which is a Spanish Madrid-based tone wood supplier, they buy wood from musical instrument makers and sell them to people who make their own instruments or what have you. They're friends of ours, and they said, hey, this guy's selling an ebony mill in Yaoundé, Cameroon. And we had always got our ebony from Cameroon. And we saw it as a real opportunity to be vertically integrated, which is kind of rare within the industry, on an important traditionally used tone wood, ebony, and in a rough neighborhood, in a part of the world where transparency and governance can be quite challenged. And we thought, well, the buck's going to stop with us, like we're not going to have to trust somebody who gives us a piece of paper with a bunch of stamps on it. We're going to own it. And we might have been quite naive, but we did it anyway. And we've spent a lot of money. Bob Taylor has spent a lot of money. Taylor has invested a lot transforming this mill. The short story on the mill is we did such a good job that in 2016, John Kerry, who was at that point the Secretary of State, presented us with the ACE Award. And the ACE Award is an award that the U.S. State Department gives out annually to U.S. companies operating overseas that are adhering to the highest standards of ethical responsibility. Anyway, we got that award for running the company and treating the employees fairly and all the rest. But along the way, Bob started asking questions about ebony. Well, how much is there? How does it reproduce? Very, very basic questions. And was very frustrated to learn what a lot of environmental tree people have long known, which is especially in the tropics, our understanding of specific trees, the life cycle of ebony. That's the first tropical we've ever heard of because of the piano, but something as marquee as ebony, science, the world knows very, very, very little about the basic ecology. So Bob hired this guy to do a literature survey. What do we know? We found out, I still have that literature survey. It's very basic. Most of it's like stuff written in the 50s in French. And it basically says, we don't really know. So about this time, the US ambassador at the time, Michael Hosa, a great guy, he forced Bob to meet Tom Smith, Professor Tom Smith from UCLA. Tom had been going to Cameroon for 30 years, and he's like the world's preeminent authority on like African birds. And he had just founded a new entity called the Congo Basin Institute. And the Congo Basin Institute is the first overseas affiliate of UCLA. In UCLA's history, they only have one overseas affiliate, and it's the Congo Basin Institute. And the Ebony Project, what became known as the Ebony Project, was the Congo Basin Institute's first project. Bob agreed to fund it. He's like, well, here's $200,000. Next year, here's $300,000. Like, Bob paid for it. This is a guy who like didn't take a paycheck for the first 20 years of Taylor Guitars because he was living in a shack in East County. And he grew up to be a wealthy, successful man. He makes a good guitar. So he's also cares about things, and he started funding the Ebony Project. Fast forward. So what is the Ebony Project? The Ebony Project, it's based around the Jaw, and the Jaw is a World Heritage Site, forested area in central Cameroon. Very important. Cameroon, the Congo Basin, is still a largely forested area. In the 80s and 90s, the world hammered South America, the Amazon. And then when the politics were like too much and they had to slow it down and clean up their act, and they cut most of it anyway, or a lot of it, they moved on to Southeast Asia. And that's when the world started hearing about palm oil, and Indonesia, Malaysia, and that rest of that region, that geography. And now they're on to the last one, and the last big tropical frontier is the Congo Basin. And the truth is the Congo Basin is still a largely forested area, but don't blink, they're hitting it pretty hard. So we're operating in an area that is still heavily forested. We all know that roads are the cancer of a forest. Like once you punch a road into an intact forest region, it starts to, from the satellites, you can see it collapsing on each side of the road, and the canopy weakening and all the rest. So the Ebony Project plants ebony, plants food, because food security is a major problem in this area. We're dealing with Bantu and Baka people. The Baka people, Jack, when you and I were young, would be called pygmies. They're the Baka people. So about half the projects, we're operating in 13 villages, about half are Baka, about half are Bantu. And we are basically paying these communities and giving them the resources to start a nursery, to grow ebony, to plant ebony, to grow a diversity of fruit trees. Well, I had a National Geographic journalist with me out there, and he kept the question. We took him to like 10 villages, and eventually he asked somebody in each village, why are you doing this? Why are you planting this? These trees will not be of any value for 100 years or 120 years. And that's important because Taylor's not doing this because we want the wood. Like, we're all going to be dead. What happens to these trees? A generation or two will determine what they want to do with those. By the way, it is like an 80% survival rate. But the answer that was given was twofold. They all said, so my grandchildren remember my name, but it also helps with local demarcation issues. And there are tensions. It's a complicated story, but there are tensions over who owns what in an area where half the community is traditionally a forest migratory community, the Baka. And for various reasons, they're being, let's just say, encouraged to move permanent settlement closer to the roads. and who owns what, can be contentious. It's very all informal land demarcation understandings, most of it. And if you plant out a region, then everyone's like, oh, no brainer. That guy owns this land. He's working the land. And we're actually in an area that's slowly decaying because a road was built and people plant food to live. We're kind of biologically recomplicating the area by putting in ebony and putting in fruit trees. And the ebony helps with, they're paid to do it. It helps with de-escalating land conflict to some degree, we're told. There's also a lot of original science. Bob Taylor pays for a lot of frankly, most of the world's understanding of Diospyros crassiflora, West African ebony, has been the result of the Congo Basin Institute's ecological research that they've been doing. And all of that has been paid for by Bob Taylor and, in-kind support by Taylor Guitars and UCLA. So again, I could go on that, but it's
Yeah,
just,
yeah,
it's an
fascinating.
amazing,
Yeah.
amazing thing to experience.
So this is basically a food forest project. We do a lot of stories on agroforestry, and
Yeah.
so that fits into that rubric. That's really interesting work. I'm also interested in what Taylor the guitars, I guess you've been sourcing koa via the Paniola tone woods. Now you talked about tone woods a little bit and I cut you off. So there's a partnership that you're doing in Hawaii. You want to explain what Taylor Guitars has been doing out there?
It's another great project, totally different, but basically the same. It's in Hawaii, and we do two things in Hawaii in partnership in a joint venture with this group, Pacific Rim Tone Woods, who operates up in Concrete, Washington. Fantastic place. Bob calls them Paul Bunyan meets Martha Stewart. They're really smart, responsible guys, and they've been providing us with spruce. We partnered with them in Hawaii, and there's two things that we do. One is a form of stewardship contracting. It's a Forest Service concept where we'll go on to other people's property. And these are forested lands that have been beat up pretty bad. There's a lot of migratory pasture lands where there's pasture lands cut throughout the forest and then trails for cattle to be moved from one pasture to another. Hawaii is the most remote island chain on the planet, and its flora and fauna are the pacifists of the plant community, of the animal community. They didn't evolve to defend themselves because they didn't have to. And now you've introduced all of these, plant and animal species from the mainlands that evolved to survive. They've got hoofs, they've got horns, they fight for their turf. And a lot of the local Hawaiian flora and fauna can't compete with that. So one of the biggest problems with a lot of places in Hawaii is the spread of all these invasive exotic species. So that's what's happening to a lot of forests. And the deal of stewardship contracting in a nutshell is we agree that we're going to cut down a certain number, predetermined number of koa trees, and we're going to build guitars out of those. And that money that we spend goes into a special bank account, and that special bank account can only be accessed by these guys at Pacific Rim Tone Woods, who go in along with Nick Koch, who's our local Hawaiian forester and a Hawaiian team. And you got to build fences. And I'm talking serious fences. And you got to hunt out all the feral sheep and pig and cows, and got to move them out. And then we plant koa. And it was like they kept telling me this would happen, and I believed it, but it was an intellectual theory that if you could just move out all of the invasive animals, then koa will reappear, because the koa seed is dormant but active under the soil for for decades. And you just need to give it a chance. You need to scarify the land, scratch it up, and it will return. But when it does return, there's always a cow or a sheep or a pig, and it'll eat it. It's like all you can eat salad bar. And now, a few years later, I was just back recently, and the fence is there, and we're kind of riding the fence line, making sure that a tree didn't fall and smash the fence or whatever. And I'm telling you, Jack, it's mind blowing, because on one side of the fence, you can count 50 koa trees that are a foot tall that just popped up and are protected from being eaten. And you look on the other side of the fence, and it's just a traditional looking cow field. There's nothing.
Wow.
And you can even see the length of like a sheep or cow or pig snoot sticking its nose through the fence.
Yeah.
On our side of the fence, the koa that koa has been chomped.
Wow.
But it's amazing. So two other things about Hawaii. The other thing we do is Bob Taylor bought like 580 acres of, it looks like, pristine Scottish golf course. It was once primeval forest, thought to be some of the best koa land on the island back in King Kamehameha's time. But it's been a cattle field for 100 years. We bought that, and we're planting koa. And we're going to return koa and ohia and a couple of other species. And we believe that in 50 or 60 years, the entire area will be closed canopy, and it will be a little bit like New England forestry, where it will stay in closed canopy. There'll be selected harvest where we'll take one tree here, one tree there, one tree there, but it'll largely stay in canopy. And we project that we will be able to supply all the koa that the musical instrument industry worldwide needs from this one piece of property. And I'm not saying that it's going to be a monopoly and they can only buy it from here, but the volume that we can produce off of this one property is projected to be enough to satisfy global demand. So just think about that for 1 second. This is like one little demonstration project, spending its own money to do something because it wants to. And we're just a little rinky-dinky guitar company with our friends up in the Pacific Northwest. Imagine if real funds and energy focused on true restoration and not some of this BS restoration that, plant 1 million trees, no, 10 million, no, 1 billion, no, 20 billion. That's great, but a lot of it's silly.
Yeah, I wanted to ask, so we've got the monocrop plantation model, which we see a lot. We see it in the U.S. South. We see it all over the place, really. Certainly in the Pacific Northwest, you see a lot of it. How is what you're doing in Hawaii differ? Like that koa, how are they creating or trying to create what would be a functioning, diverse, biodiverse forest?
Well, it'll be a production forest. There will be cross sections and segments that'll be mixed use. There'll be areas where a Hawaiian forest is naturally koa centric, koa heavy, koa and ohia. This forest will be more koa heavy than it would be, quote unquote, naturally, what it looked like hundreds of years ago. But I want to step away from what ours will look like, because it's not going to be a monocultural site. It'll be heavy koa, but it's certainly not going to be by any means monocultural. But your point is really interesting, because when people talk about reforestation projects and people talk about what is a forest, what is deforestation, what is reforestation, I wasted my youth in conferences debating these issues. Yeah. And it's really complicated, because most people, you go on a hike and the hiking trail is set up along a ridge of this beautiful old growth forest with fat trees, thin trees, ferns, it's beautiful. But 5-minute walk off that trail left or right, and you're into a more monocultural area sometimes. And a lot of times you're flying over a region. It looks like, oh my God, it's all trees, it's all forest. And then you go walk that area, and it's a monocultural, in some cases, biological dead zone. You don't even see squirrels in there. Now, to be clear, there is nothing wrong with that. There is a time and a place for that. But humanity's got to get past the it's a forest or it's not a forest, because all forests are not the same. And yes, we need fiber baskets. We need monocultural plantations because I'm sorry, you look around your house, I look around my house, wood is everywhere. Wood has been the primary natural resource that
Yeah,
humanity has
absolutely.
used from the beginning of time.
Yeah,
There's 8 billion of us, and don't be naive, don't be stupid. We need these monocultural rapid rotation places, but
but
don't let them trick you that, oh, it's a forest. We have all this. It's just like, no, dude, you're doing good stuff, but don't tell me, don't trick me that this is a forest as I envision a forest.
yeah, well, that's an interesting point. Really love to have you here. There's so much more we could talk about, but our time is limited. Can you tell us how people can follow what's going on over at Taylor Guitars?
Yeah, and again, quickly, ending up at a guitar company is really interesting because to go back, we buy a little bit of wood from a lot of places, and everyone loves the guitar. Red states, blue states, it crosses culture, it crosses language. So it's an acoustic guitar is a cultural totem. It's the sword Excalibur. People just immediately the giant convention room will go silent if you walk on stage and hold one over your head, even if you don't play it. It's a special thing. And that special thing is wholly dependent upon healthy forest resources from around the planet. So it's an incredible bully pulpit to have and say, hey, I don't care if you're left, right, it doesn't make a difference to me. If you like this guitar, if you care about the future of this guitar, then we do have to have a grown-up discussion about where the wood comes from and what it's going to take to survive as a species on this planet. So we're just a little guitar company. We have some awesome demonstration projects in Cameroon and Hawaii. What we're doing with urban trees and urban wood, I'm also very proud of. They're demonstration projects. But if you go to the Taylor Guitars website, Sustainability Hub, which is constantly trying to get a little bit better, or Wood and Steel, if you Google Scott Paul Wood and Steel, like all my blogs that cover everything that Taylor Guitars does is there. And it's great, not because it's my job, but again, it's the guitar. And the guitar is this magical thing that people let their guard down and they love it. They love music. They love the Beatles. They country music, rock music, every type of music. I once was with a guy for like 3 days from China at a Greenpeace meeting, and I didn't think he spoke a word of English, Lu Bing. And then Friday night we're drinking and he ends up with a guitar in his hand and he sings Let It Be with a Liverpool accent. And it shows you the power of this thing.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
at the end of my career, I ended up here, and I hope to use that power to just make people aware that we need to have a more sophisticated conversation about natural resources. And I'm a tree guy, so that's the one I talk about.
yeah. Well, thank you for sharing with us today on Eco Justice Radio, Scott Paul. And, we really appreciate the amazing work that you've been doing for so many years.
Thank you, Jack. It was a pleasure to see I think I met you when we were like 12 or something. So it's good to see that we're still out there fighting the fight.
That's right. And onward. Many more years may there be.
Yes, indeed.